Dawn breaks over the salt-stung shores of northern Francia in the year 845 AD. The air is already thick with the tension of a continent awakening too late to the threat it barely comprehends. Only months before, small bands of Norsemen had begun probing the coasts of the Frankish realm, hit-and-run raids on monasteries, villages, and trading posts, but now a vast fleet had appeared on the horizon, more organized, more numerous than anyone could have anticipated. The River Seine lies still in the half-light, a silver blade cutting through the land, and along its banks a hastily assembled host of Frankish soldiers stands. Their shields are mismatched, their mail patched, yet their eyes are fixed on the river's bend where a low mist curls. Slowly, almost silently, the first dragon-prowed ship slips into view. Its hull is dark as wet iron, its oars dipping in perfect unison. Behind it, scores more emerge from the fog, gliding forward like living shadows. The Franks shout orders, tightening their line, but even their commanders cannot suppress the dread creeping into their bones. They know Paris has burned once already in memory and rumor. They know that the Northmen have evolved from opportunistic raiders into a force that can strike with precision, speed, and terrifying coordination. Ahead of them, the fleet is ready to force a reckoning. Tribute will be demanded, the city may fall. And yet, this desperate attempt to halt the tide is only a late chapter in a story that began far earlier, long before sails darkened the Seine or Frankish kings scrambled to comprehend the men behind the axes. Centuries of harsh winters, ice-choked fjords, dense forests, and frostbitten farms had forged a people hardened by scarcity and necessity. In the deep valleys of Norway, along Denmark's wind-whipped lowlands, and beside Sweden's broad, twisting rivers, the story of the Vikings was already taking shape. Ships designed to conquer both river and ocean, chieftains consolidating power, trade networks expanding, and warriors learning the arts of both raiding and settlement. Before the Viking Age, in the northern reaches of Europe, long before the thunder of war horns and the clatter of iron reached the coasts of England and Francia, between 500 and 750 CE, the land itself shaped the lives of those who would one day be called Vikings. Scandinavia, still raw and untamed, stretched across jagged fjords, dense conifer forests, and windswept plateaus. Winter blanketed Norway's mountains in snow so thick that rivers froze solid and the air bit sharply. In Denmark, lowlands were pierced by streams and bogs, fertile yet treacherous, the soil dark and stubborn under the till of early farmers. Sweden's waterways carved paths through thick forests. As the centuries turned, these landscapes cradled tribes and chieftaincies that would one day form the backbone of Norse society. By the 6th century, Germanic tribes across Scandinavia began to coalesce into early Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian groups. They were bound by kinship, language, and the first inklings of regional identity. Proto-Norse became the tongue of the North, etched in rudimentary runes on stones, weapons, and jewelry. Amid forests and fjords, small settlements clustered around rivers and natural harbors, their wooden homes sturdy against snow and wind. Iron, once rare, spread through the region, enabling more effective tools and weapons. This laid the foundation for both sustenance and conquest. The evolution of the sea itself would dictate the trajectory of these people. By the late 6th century, shipwrights began to refine the clinker-built design, overlapping planks, forming hulls resilient enough for both river and open sea travel. Light, flexible, and swift, these vessels allowed chieftains to reach distant communities, explore uncharted waters, and transport goods or men with unprecedented efficiency. Along the coasts, smiths hammered iron, merchants exchanged amber and furs, and the scent of smoke from wood-fired kilns mingled with the brine of the North Sea. Even then, the northern tribes were beginning to look outward. The 7th century witnessed the emergence of small regional power centers. Hillforts rose upon knolls like stone sentinels. Upakra in southern Sweden and Bore in Norway guarded the fertile lands beneath them. These forts, while defensive, also became seats of authority, where chieftains administered justice, presided over feasts, and marshaled warriors. Within their wooden halls, torches flickered over the polished skulls of cattle, the gleam of bronze brooches, and the runic inscriptions marking clan ownership. Beyond the fortifications, common folk tilled fields, fished in rivers, and hunted in forests, their labor sustaining both the elite and the nascent economy. By the mid-7th century, pagan cult sites, circular wooden temples at Upakra, stone altars at Bore, and carved idols were scattered across hilltops and riverbanks. At these sites, livestock, cattle, goats, or horses were offered to deities such as Odin, Thor, and Frey, sometimes in blood sacrifice at wooden stakes or stone troughs. Seasonal festivals punctuated the agricultural year. In spring, prayers and libations sought fertile soil. Midsummer saw hilltop bonfires guiding the sun and invoking abundance. In autumn, harvest feasts included song, storytelling, and symbolic offerings of mead and grain. Trade routes extended the influence of these northern peoples. From around 700 AD, the waterways of Sweden funneled goods toward the Baltic, while Danish ports opened channels to Frisia and beyond. Norse traders navigated rivers inland, exchanging furs, amber, and iron for silver, textiles, and exotic wares from the Slavic and Frankish worlds. Villages along these routes thrived. Merchants' huts stood alongside taverns and shipyards, their docks alive with the creak of timbers and the chatter of languages from far-off lands. By the mid-8th century, larger longships appeared, their elongated hulls capable of voyages across the tumultuous North Sea. These were no longer mere transports. They now carried warriors, supplies, and the ambition of chieftains eager to test the wider world. Population pressures in Norway and Denmark intensified as arable land reached its limits. Petty kings consolidated power, weaving alliances through marriage, oath, and occasional violence. These leaders, though small in number, wielded authority bolstered by the capacity to move swiftly across water. As the 8th century drew to a close, pressures accumulated. Populations were strained under limited resources. Ambitious chieftains sought to extend influence beyond local shores. Trade brought both wealth and the temptation to take more by force. The stage was set for a transformation. Dawn of the Viking Age. In 793 AD at Lindisfarne, the monastery's walls trembled as the first recorded Viking raid shocked the British Isles. This was the dawn of the Viking Age. From the grey waters of the North Sea, longships appeared on the horizon, their prows carved into menacing shapes, their sails dark with tar. Before dawn, the air was pierced by the clash of iron and the screams of monks. Torches illuminated the terrified faces of those who had lived in devout seclusion, while axes tore through doors and sacred shrines. The raid was surgical, precise, and swift. A shockwave rippled through Christian Europe. The Norsemen had entered history not as mere raiders, but as a force shaped by land, sea, and ambition. In the years that followed, the pattern intensified. Between 794 and 795, the monks of Iona and the Irish coastal monasteries learned the terror of the Northmen firsthand. Timbered ships glided silently across cold waters, warriors leaping ashore with axes, spears, and fire. Villages fled or fortified themselves in haste, yet few could resist the sudden, brutal onslaught. Seasonal bases were established along coasts and river mouths, signaling a shift from opportunistic raiding to semi-permanent occupation. By the early 9th century, Scandinavian raiders had crossed the North Sea to strike Frisia and the coasts of Carolingian Francia. Towns along the Seine and Rhine faced recurring raids, merchants fled with goods, and local lords scrambled to organize defenses or pay tribute. By 841, the Norse had fortified a long fort at Dublin, transforming from raiders to settlers. Timber palisades enclosed temporary towns, ships rested in protected harbors, and winter supplies were stockpiled. The transition marked the growth of permanent influence and control. Trade networks expanded alongside martial ambition. Silver from the continent flowed north, furs and amber traveled south, and young warriors trained year-round, their techniques honed on rivers and fjords before they were unleashed on distant shores. In 845, the legendary figure Ragnar Lodbrok, whose name would echo in sagas for generations, led an audacious strike on Paris. From the mouth of the Seine, his fleet of nearly 120 longships, each 60 feet in length, narrow and shallow-drafted, slipped silently through marshlands and tidal flats. The Vikings approached the city undetected until the last possible moment. Dragon-prowed and sleek, their longships cut through the water like knives, oars rising and falling in perfect unison. Paris itself braced, but inadequately. Charles the Bald had summoned a mixed host of levies, militia, and a handful of trained men-at-arms, some 5,000 to 6,000 in total. The infantry was largely peasants, conscripted hastily, armed with spears, farm tools, and worn shields. A small corps of professional Frankish soldiers, mail-clad and experienced, was scattered along wooden palisades and a low stone bridge spanning the Seine. Archers, few in number, unevenly distributed, tended elevated positions, aiming across the river. Cavalry, 500 strong, held behind the lines on higher ground, but the marshy floodplain rendered charges slow and dangerous. Coordination was weak. Messages between commanders often failed to reach the front lines, and fear gnawed at morale. The Viking strategy relied on speed, surprise, and riverine advantage. Ragnar divided his forces into 3 squadrons. One flanked the right bank, probing defences and drawing Frankish attention. The main fleet crept along the river's bend, hidden in mist. A third unit manoeuvred upstream to prevent reinforcements. Archers aboard longships rained arrows down on the defenders, while grappling hooks and planks allowed the vanguard to scale fortifications. Axes and sea-axes flashed as men formed interlocking shields, pushing into palisades with relentless pressure. Fire rafts floated downstream, ignited timber structures, and created smoke that obscured defensive positions. The Franks attempted countermeasures. Archers fired volleys at the approaching ships, but narrow angles, panic, and the Vikings' high shields rendered most ineffective. Cavalry tried to charge across soggy riverbanks. Hooves sank into mud, leaving riders vulnerable to missile fire and cut down by axes and spears. Attempts to burn Viking ships at anchor failed as longships could shift with the tide, keeping out of range. Infantry formations collapsed under the dual pressure of psychological terror and physical assault. Ragnar's logistical foresight was striking. The Vikings had scouted months in advance, timing their advance for high water so ships could approach closer to the city walls. Grappling hooks, ladders, and planks were pre-positioned. Detachments moved in synchronized waves, attacking multiple points simultaneously, preventing the Franks from massing forces. Retreat was already planned. If resistance stiffened, longships could slip downstream under cover of fog, regroup, and strike again. Panic spread among the Frankish troops, local levies broke ranks, and the command chain disintegrated. Charles the Bald, faced with mounting pressure from nobles fearing loss of lands and families, agreed to pay 20,000 livres of silver. This tribute secured a temporary respite for Paris, yet the city had burned in parts, and the Norse reputation for strategic cunning and ferocity was cemented. The siege also signaled a shift in Viking operations. No longer mere seasonal raiders, these Norsemen were capable of coordinated campaigns, combining logistics, settlement reconnaissance, and direct assault. By 850, the Vikings' relationship with England and northern Francia shifted decisively. Overwintering forces became common, marking a transition from seasonal plunder to territorial ambition. Encampments solidified along rivers and estuaries, and Norse leaders began to cultivate alliances with local chieftains, trading influence and protection for supplies. Fjords offered concealment for sudden departures, rivers became avenues for rapid inland raids, and the prevailing winds could turn a retreat into a surprise attack. Villages along the coasts and estuaries adapted, some fortifying against inevitable assaults, others choosing pragmatic collaboration with the Norse presence to ensure survival. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden each contained multiple petty kingdoms, often at odds yet united in martial culture and maritime expertise. Britain's patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was vulnerable, fractured, and poorly coordinated in defense. Francia struggled with internal divisions. The remnants of Carolingian consolidation stretched thin across a vast and varied terrain. The Baltic offered rich trade and raiding grounds, while the western steppes remained home to Slavic communities and riverine trade networks. Within Scandinavia, the consolidation of power continued. Chieftains strengthened fortifications, maintained fleets, and trained warriors in both seasonal warfare and prolonged campaigns. Hill forts expanded, and assembly sites or things formalized legal and military coordination. Wealth accumulated through tribute and trade, funding both armaments and luxury, while seasonal movements ensured population pressures were temporarily relieved. Yet tensions simmered. Overpopulation, rival claims, and the lure of riches abroad created a combustible mix. This foreshadowed the large-scale expeditions to come, such as the formation of the Great Heathen Army decades later. By the middle of the 9th century, the first tremors of an era of expansion had become a rolling tide. Longships plied rivers and seas with uncanny efficiency, raiding parties coordinated over hundreds of kilometers, and fortified coastal bases signaled strategic permanence. Europe learned to recognize the distinct signature of Norse aggression: sudden, swift, and devastating. Monasteries, towns, and ports adjusted, often in vain. The eruption of raiding violence, first so shocking at Lindisfarne, became a recurring crescendo in the growing saga of Viking ambition. A world shaped by land and sea, by climate and craft, by ambition and opportunity, now braced for a dramatic transformation. From here on, the Vikings spread out. The Scandinavian expansion in the North Atlantic. In the mid-9th century, reconnaissance voyages to the North Atlantic hardened into permanent settlement. Ingolfr Arnason, a Norwegian chieftain traditionally remembered through the medieval Icelandic chronicle Landnámabók, arrived in 874 as part of a wave of families fleeing the political unification efforts of King Harald Fairhair, the first monarch to consolidate much of Norway under a single crown in the late 9th century. Harald's rise disrupted the older system of semi-independent regional rulers. Rival chieftains who refused to submit found their lands confiscated or their influence curtailed. Many of these displaced families of warriors, farmers, shipwrights, and their households turned westward into the North Atlantic. Ingolfr was one of them, and his settlement near what later became Reykjavik marked the deliberate redirection of Norway's political elites, minor nobles, and their dependence toward new, unclaimed territories where their authority could persist without interference from a centralizing king. Over the next several decades, these migrants established themselves along Iceland's fjords and river mouths. They were not anonymous drifters, but identifiable lineages recorded in Landnámabók. Powerful clans such as the Aud, the Deep-Minded family, whose matriarch was a widowed Christian noblewoman from the Hebrides, the descendants of Ketil Flatnose, a prominent Norwegian warlord with ties to Scotland and the Isles, and the followers of Hjörleifr Hrodmarsson, Ingolfr's foster brother, whose murder by slaves prompted one of the island's earliest recorded acts of retribution. These settlers arrived with ships, livestock, enslaved workers, and portable wealth. Longhouses of turf and drift timber rose along sheltered inlets as families charted grazing ranges through volcanic soil and scanned the horizon for storms rolling off the Greenland Sea. Between 880 and 930, the social fabric woven by these families transformed scattered homesteads into defined regional power blocks. Leadership rested in the hands of Godar, local chieftains whose authority came not from inherited monarchy but from their ability to gather followers, maintain feuds, negotiate alliances, and uphold honor within their districts. Figures such as Thorstein Ingolfsson, son of Ingolfr, and other second-generation leaders drew on kinship, marriage, and wealth, especially control of grazing land and trading ports, to solidify influence. These Godar were political brokers, not absolute rulers. Their power depended on personal reputation, generosity at seasonal feasts, and their skill in mediating disputes before conflicts escalated into blood feuds. As the population grew and land claims multiplied, the need for a coordinated legal order became unavoidable. The gathering at Thingvellir in 930, where the Althing was founded, brought together dozens of these chieftains and hundreds of free farmers. This was the construction of a working institution. The law was recited orally by the Lögsogumadur, or law speaker, elected for a 3-year term. Disputes over grazing boundaries, inheritance rights, homicide payments, and shipwreck salvage were heard and judged. The assembly created a shared mechanism for resolving the tensions. By formally anchoring legal authority in a public assembly rather than in a monarchy, the Icelanders established one of the earliest parliamentary systems in the world. Westward expansion into Greenland proved to be even more demanding. Eric the Red, born Erik Thorvaldsson in Norway, and later exiled first from Norway and then from Iceland for a series of violent disputes and killings, became the driving force behind this new frontier. His final exile around 982 forced him to look beyond the familiar seas. Guided by earlier, fragmentary reports of land sighted to the west, he launched a voyage across the Denmark Strait, a treacherous stretch of nearly 300 nautical miles where drifting pack ice, fog banks, and strong subpolar currents claimed many ships before they ever glimpsed land. Eric's crossing succeeded against all odds. When he reached the convoluted coastline of southern Greenland, he traced its fjords carefully, mapping pastures and settlement sites on narrow habitable strips later known as the Eastern and Western Settlements. The people who followed him between 985 and 986 were not adventurers seeking novelty. They were established Icelandic and Norwegian families uprooted by internal feuds, shifting alliances, and the tightening grip of regional chieftains and rising kings. Among them were kin groups connected to Eric's own family, including the households of Thjodhilda, Eric's wife, and their children Leif, Thorvald, and Freydis, wealthy farmers seeking new hayfields for their herds, and retainers, thralls, carpenters, and blacksmiths whose labor underpinned every aspect of colonial survival. They made landfall at fjords such as those at Kasiarsuk, Eric's Bratalid, and Igaliku, immediately constructing turf and stone farmsteads designed to insulate against Arctic winters. These sites still preserve the outlines of longhouses, byres, and churches. In Greenland, summer demanded uninterrupted labor. The settlers had to get busy cutting and drying enough hay to sustain cattle through the long winter, moving sheep across marginal slopes where thin soils provided brief but necessary grazing, and repairing buildings battered by storms. Marine resources filled the gaps. Families organized seal hunts along predictable migration routes, capturing ringed and harp seals whose meat and fat were essential winter stores. Periodic journeys northward to Disco Bay and other rich hunting grounds supplied walrus ivory, hide, and narwhal tusks, luxury commodities prized in European markets, especially in Scandinavia and along the Baltic trade networks. Households tracked fodder reserves with mathematical precision, knowing that one harsh storm or an early freeze could doom entire herds. Driftwood, carried from Siberia and North America by Arctic currents, functioned as the colony's primary timber supply, and its scarcity shaped everything from ship repair to house construction. Sea ice dictated the rhythm of movement. Its late retreat could delay hunting expeditions, while its early return could trap travelers in remote camps for the winter. Every decision, whether to slaughter livestock early, to commit men to a distant walrus hunt, or to risk a voyage to Iceland, carried consequences. Around 1000, Leif Erikson launched another westward expedition, guided by earlier sightings made by Bjarni Herjolfsson, whose drifting voyage along unfamiliar coastlines hinted at land beyond the known world. Leif's landfall at sites corresponding to modern Lonceau meadows in Newfoundland provided woodlands far richer than Iceland's deforested slopes and soils capable of producing self-sown grain. The Norse called these regions Helluland, Markland, and Vinland, distinguishing them by rock formations, forest cover, and seasonal bounty. Though attempts at permanent settlement faltered due to conflicts with indigenous populations, known in the sagas as Skrælingjar, and the logistical strain of maintaining transatlantic supply lines, the voyages represent the westernmost reach of medieval European expansion before Columbus by nearly 500 centuries. By the millennium's end, the Norse world stretched from the river plains of Eastern Europe to the tundra farms of Greenland and the coastal clearings of Vinland. Networks of law, trade, and kinship bound these distant communities. But warfare, raiding, plundering, and looting never ended back in Europe. The Vikings in England. In 865, from East Anglia's mist-laden coast, a great army arrived, known to history as the Great Heathen Army. Led by the enigmatic Ivar the Boneless and the seasoned Halfdan, the force was a composite of Norse warriors from various regions. This was not a raiding party. The capture of York in 866 marked a turning point. The city, situated on the Ouse and protected by marshy approaches, became the heart of a Viking kingdom in Northumbria. Timber fortifications were erected, gates reinforced, and longhouses built to accommodate warriors and settlers alike. From these positions, raiding parties fanned out across the surrounding lands, exploiting weaknesses in Anglo-Saxon defences, collecting tribute and consolidating control. The year 869 brought grim consequences for East Anglia. King Edmund, renowned for his piety and valor, was captured and executed by the Viking forces. The act sent shockwaves across England. By 870, the army had turned its attention to Wessex, the kingdom that remained unconquered. Here, Alfred, recently ascended to the throne alongside his brother Ethelred, faced an existential threat in the face of the Battle of Ashdown. On January 8, 871, the West Saxons faced the great heathen army head-on. Kings Alfred and Ethelred had mobilized hastily, assembling levies from across the kingdom, while the Vikings, numbering 3,000 to 5,000, were seasoned warriors adept in raiding, shield wall formations, and psychological intimidation. The battlefield itself was a ridge near the Berkshire Downs, where terrain played a decisive role. The Vikings took the high ground, a tactical advantage that allowed their archers and frontline shield-bearers to disrupt advancing Saxon formations. Ethelred initially positioned his army for a direct assault, but according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it was Alfred, commanding a segment of the Saxon forces, who took the initiative by attacking the Viking flank, despite the ridge favoring the defenders. The Saxons arrayed infantry in shield wall formations, emphasizing cohesion, discipline, and mutual protection against Viking axes and spears, while engaging in archery from the flanks where possible. The clash was ferocious, marked by intense hand-to-hand combat as Saxon lines met the Danish shield wall. Contemporary sources suggest the battle unfolded in two main phases: an initial push by Ethelred's contingent that was stalled by Viking resistance, followed by Alfred's decisive intervention, which exploited weaknesses in the Danish formation caused by uneven deployment along the ridge. The combined Saxon assault eventually broke the Viking lines, forcing a retreat. Casualties were high on both sides, though records indicate significant losses for the Danes, weakening their immediate capacity to threaten Wessex. The Battle of Ashdown demonstrated that the Saxons had learned to coordinate flexible counterattacks against the disciplined Viking shield wall. However, the Vikings too had adapted to extended engagements beyond quick raiding. Strategically, Ashdown preserved Wessex as a stronghold for resistance, setting the stage for Alfred's later campaigns. From 873 to 876, the Viking armies divided. Halfdan settled in Northumbria, consolidating power and integrating local populations into the Norse administrative and tribute systems. Guthrum, meanwhile, led raids further south, testing the resilience of Mercia and Wessex, probing defenses, and gathering wealth and intelligence. The fragmented approach allowed the Vikings to apply pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously, stretching Anglo-Saxon resources thin and leveraging local discontent in favor of Scandinavian expansion. The defining confrontation came in 878 at the Battle of Edington. Alfred, employing fortified towns and strategic withdrawals to draw Guthrum into unfavorable terrain, confronted the Norse in a decisive engagement. The great heathen army, led by Guthrum, having already devastated much of Wessex, was encamped and overconfident. The confrontation happened near Edington in Wiltshire, where the terrain consisted of open fields interspersed with small rivers and hedgerows, favoring both infantry cohesion and flanking maneuvers. Alfred's forces were composed primarily of levied Anglo-Saxon infantry drawn from shires loyal to Wessex, supplemented by small contingents of trained household troops and retainers. These soldiers carried wooden or iron-shod shields, spears, and occasionally swords, and were arranged in shield wall formations. This was the backbone of Anglo-Saxon tactical doctrine. In contrast, Guthrum's army combined seasoned Viking warriors, including huskarls, heavily armed elite retainers, raiding bands and levies drawn from previously conquered territories in East Anglia and Mercia. They relied on a combination of shield walls, archery, and close-quarters axe and spear combat. The battle unfolded with Alfred initiating a disciplined advance from fortified positions established after leaving Athelney. The Saxons deployed in a dense shield wall, absorbing the initial Viking assault while reserving contingents on the flanks to exploit weaknesses in Guthrum's formation. Ultimately, Guthrum's shield wall fractured under sustained pressure, forcing a retreat and leading to his eventual surrender and baptism at Aller. The victory at Edington secured Wessex and marked a turning point in the Viking Wars. The subsequent Treaty of Wedmore established boundaries of the Danelaw, creating a geopolitical patchwork where Norse law and Anglo-Saxon rule coexisted uneasily. The late 9th century saw Wessex transform defensively. Alfred instituted burhs, fortified towns strategically placed to secure trade routes, river crossings, and vulnerable plains. These fortifications, supported by standing militias, provided both deterrent and rapid response capability. Over the ensuing decades, Edward the Elder and Ethelflaed of Mercia mounted campaigns that reclaimed territories from Danelaw control, targeting Derby and Leicester, reinforcing English dominion and shrinking the Norse footprint. The Battle of Brunanburh in 937 represented the zenith of this struggle. King Athelstan faced a coalition of Norse, Scots, and Strathclyde forces. The battlefield, a wide plain intersected by riverine channels, amplified the importance of infantry cohesion and archery, while cavalry executed flanking maneuvers where possible. The Norse, experienced in rapid strikes and encirclement tactics, were met with a disciplined, centralized command structure. The resulting English victory solidified Athelstan's authority, reinforced territorial integrity, and marked a high point in the resistance against Scandinavian encroachment, yet the Norse presence persisted. York remained a contested centre, often under the rule of ambitious leaders like Eric Bloodaxe, whose eventual expulsion in 954 signalled the end of an independent Viking kingdom in northern England. By this time, Viking activity had shifted from outright conquest to integration, settlement, and occasional rebellion. Trade networks flourished, towns evolved into fortified markets, and intermarriage and political alliance became routine. By 954, with the end of independent Norse rule in York, England entered a new chapter. However, England was far from the only contested land for the Vikings. The Vikings in Ireland. In 795, a fleet of long, narrow ships appeared off Lambay Island, just north of Dublin. This was the beginning of the Viking presence in Ireland and Scotland. Contemporary annals record the suddenness of the attack. Monks heard the crash of oars before glimpsing the tall, helmeted raiders advancing along the shore. Over the following decades, these early raids became almost routine. From 802 to 821, the monastery of Iona, perched on a remote island off the western Scottish coast, suffered repeated attacks, its stone churches and wooden halls looted, leaving echoes of psalms replaced by the clash of iron and the cries of defenders. Despite their martial success abroad, the Norse remained politically fragmented at home. Danish chieftains vied over tribute and territory. Norwegian jarls guarded their fjords and passes, and Swedish traders pressed east into the Baltic seeking furs and amber. Overpopulation and limited arable land pushed younger sons and ambitious warriors outward. In 841, Norse leaders Olaf the White and Amlaib Konung constructed a fortified encampment called a Longfort along the River Liffey, forming the nucleus of what became Dublin. These long forts functioned as seasonal strongholds, but over time they attracted permanent settlers, traders, craftsmen, and farmers, transforming the site into a vibrant bilingual community blending Norse and Gaelic cultures. By the mid-9th century, Norse influence expanded across Eastern Ireland, with kings and warlords exercising power over multiple provinces. Irish rulers responded with ambushes, raids, and pitched battles, exploiting the landscape of narrow valleys, river fords, and bogs to resist Norse dominance. In Scotland, the Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland became administrative centres under leaders like Sigurd the Mighty, who reinforced jarldoms with wooden halls alongside ancient stone brocks. By the mid-10th century, the Norse presence in northern Scotland and the Northern Isles had matured from isolated raiding bases into organised maritime lordships, with figures such as Thorfinn the Mighty, son of the earlier Orkney Jarl, Sigurd Hlodverson, emerging as central actors in this transformation. Thorfinn claimed the Jarldom of Orkney after a period of dynastic disputes and internal consolidation, bringing previously fragmented Norse settlements under a more centralised authority. His family had already forged ties across the North Atlantic and northern Britain, connecting Orkney, Shetland and Caithness through a network of kinship alliances, trade obligations and shared military obligations. These alliances allowed him to project power not just within the islands but across northern Scotland, where the patchwork of Pictish descendants, Gaels of the mainland and rival Norse chieftains required both diplomacy and force to navigate. Thorfinn's expansion into Caithness exemplified the intertwining of commerce, governance and military strategy that defined Norse rule. Settlements along strategic coastal points functioned as both trading posts and defensive positions. Longships could move rapidly between fjords, striking hostile communities or intercepting rival fleets, while also transporting goods such as walrus ivory, furs, and salted fish to Norway, Ireland, and beyond. Norse jarls relied on disciplined infantry armed with spears, axes, and round shields, often arrayed in shield wall formations for pitched engagements, while cavalry remained limited and largely indigenous Gaelic allies could supplement their forces. Coastal raids often involved amphibious assaults timed with tides, using knowledge of narrow inlets and river mouths to outmaneuver opponents. In skirmishes along the Pentland Firth and in northern Caithness, narrow channels, rocky promontories, and peat bogs played a decisive role in determining outcomes. These conflicts were rarely set-piece battles. Instead, they involved coordinated landings, rapid strikes, and localized ambushes. Successful campaigns reinforced Thorfinn's authority, allowing him to levy tribute, enforce local law, and establish judicial authority modeled on the legal traditions of Orkney and Norse custom. Under Thorfinn, Orkney and northern Scotland evolved into an integrated Norse maritime kingdom. Trade, law, and warfare were inseparable. The same ships that carried silver and amber also transported warriors prepared to respond to threats. However, the centuries-long Norse presence in Ireland reached a symbolic turning point at the Battle of Clontarf on Good Friday. Fought on Good Friday, April 23, 1014, the battle remains to this day one of the most famous conflicts in medieval Irish history. At this time, Ireland was a patchwork of rival kingdoms and over-kingdoms, with the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru of the Dalji Chais dynasty, seeking to consolidate authority and curb Norse influence concentrated in Dublin and its surrounding territories. Dublin had been a Norse stronghold since the mid-9th century, governed by kings and jarls such as Sigtryg Silkbeard, who maintained alliances with local Irish rulers when expedient and wielded considerable economic and military power thanks to trade networks stretching from the Hebrides to the Frankish world. By 1014, tensions had escalated as Brian sought to assert control over Leinster and the Viking settlements along the eastern coast, threatening the autonomy of both Norse rulers and allied Irish kings. In response, a coalition formed. Dublin's Norse forces, commanded by Sigtryg Silkbeard, were joined by their Leinster allies under Maelmorda mac Murchada, while Brian led a diverse army drawn from Munster, Connacht, Ulster, and other allied territories. Brian's forces relied heavily on levied infantry armed with swords, spears, and shields, arranged in shield walls that emphasized cohesion and mutual protection. Veteran warriors of the Dalji Chais and allied contingents provided discipline and leadership, while cavalry was limited but used strategically in flanking or pursuit roles. The Norse contingent combined Scandinavian warbands, wielding heavy axes and round shields, with local levies familiar with the terrain, skilled in quick strikes, ambushes, and raiding tactics honed over decades. The battle took place on open plains near Clontarf, just outside Dublin. The engagement erupted with both sides forming shield walls and probing each other's positions. The Norse leveraged their experience in close combat and surprise attacks, attempting to break the Munster-led Saxon-Irish lines with aggressive pushes and archery. The fighting was ferocious and protracted. Contemporary chronicles described the clash as lasting several hours, with the battlefield churned into mud by stamping feet and spilled blood. Brian Boru, though advanced in age, commanded from the centre, coordinating infantry movements and sending reinforcements to threatened sectors. A pivotal moment came when the cohesion of the Norse-Leinster alliance faltered. Some contingents were encircled or cut off, while the Dalji Chais maintained formation and exploited gaps in enemy lines. By late afternoon, the Norse and their allies were routed. Sigtryg Silkbeard survived, fleeing to Dublin with remnants of his forces, but Maelmorda and many prominent warriors fell. Brian Boru himself was killed, reportedly in his tent, by retreating Norsemen or opportunistic attackers, but his death came after the outcome of the battle had been secured. Clontarf did not expel the Norse entirely from Ireland. Dublin continued as a Norse Gaelic settlement, but it shattered the political dominance of Norse kings over Irish affairs, weakened Viking military influence, and symbolically marked the ascendancy of native Irish high kingship, even amid complex regional rivalries. Over time, Norse settlers became integrated into the island's social and cultural fabric. Meanwhile, on continental Europe, Viking fleets began to appear along the coasts of Frisia and northern France before the Carolingians fully understood the threat they posed. Meanwhile, back in continental Europe, Norse fleets began to appear along the Frisian and northern Frankish coasts before the Carolingians fully grasped the threat they posed. After Ragnar's siege of Paris, which resulted in Charles the Bald paying a heavy tribute to secure their withdrawal, Viking activity in Francia escalated dramatically. The Vikings recognized both the wealth of the Frankish cities and the vulnerability of their defenses. In the subsequent decades, they increasingly established long forts, enabling year-round operations along the Seine, Loire, Somme, and other major waterways. These fortified bases, often near urban centers, allowed raiding fleets to strike inland with precision and then retreat safely. The 860s and 870s saw some of the most consequential Viking raids in Francia. In 856, Paris endured another siege, this time under a coalition of Danish and Norwegian leaders, forcing Charles the Bald to organize more coordinated defenses, including fortified bridges and hastily constructed river barricades. Viking forces repeatedly targeted Rouen and Meaux, looting wealth and seizing hostages. In 885 and 886, a coalition of Viking leaders, including Sigfrid and Rollo, who would later become the first Duke of Normandy, turned to Paris once again. They commanded a fleet estimated at several hundred longships carrying thousands of warriors. The Vikings approached Paris via the Seine, just as they had under Ragnar decades ago. Longships allowed them to move swiftly, bypass difficult terrain, and carry supplies directly to the vicinity of the city. They constructed temporary camps along the riverbanks, enabling sustained operations through the winter months. The Vikings employed classic siege tactics adapted to their mobility, surrounding the city to cut off supplies, launching probing attacks to identify weak points in the walls, and constructing improvised siege engines, such as movable ladders and towers, to scale or batter fortifications. In addition, they attempted to undermine bridges and exploit tidal patterns to isolate the city from reinforcements. Their shield wall formations allowed them to repel sorties by Parisian defenders, while archers and slingers harassed the walls from the banks of the Seine. The Frankish defenders, led by Odo, Count of Paris, relied on the city's existing fortifications and improvised field defenses. They reinforced walls, positioned troops strategically on towers and gates, and conducted counterattacks when Viking forces tried to establish footholds along the riverbanks. The narrow streets and geographical features favored the defenders in close-quarter engagements, allowing relatively small forces to hold off larger contingents. Civilians assisted by maintaining supplies and repairing damaged fortifications under duress. The siege lasted nearly a year, stretching both sides to their logistical limits. Viking attempts to storm the city were repeatedly repelled, and the Seine's currents and tides complicated their maneuvers. Ultimately, the siege concluded not with outright conquest, but through negotiation. The Vikings accepted a substantial tribute and agreed to withdraw. The siege marked a turning point in Carolingian defensive policy, prompting the construction of additional fortifications along key rivers and fostering a new recognition of the strategic threat posed by sustained Viking campaigns. During the same period, the Loire Valley became another focal point. In 843, Viking raiders captured Angers, and by the 860s, Orléans faced repeated attacks. These campaigns often combined amphibious landings with inland raids, exploiting the mobility of longships and knowledge of river systems. The Franks responded by creating fortified towns, called castra, but internal political rivalries and divided loyalties limited the effectiveness of these measures. The turning point toward settlement came in 911, when Charles the Simple negotiated the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte with the Viking chieftain Rollo. Rollo received lands along the lower Seine, including Rouen, in exchange for converting to Christianity and swearing fealty. This treaty established Normandy, or the land of the Northmen, and marked a shift from raiding to semi-permanent rule, with Norse leaders integrating into the Frankish feudal system while retaining their martial traditions. Over time, Normandy became a base from which descendants of Rollo, including William the Conqueror, would exert profound influence on England and northern France. Vikings also ventured south, with fleets between 859 and 861 navigating around Iberia into the Mediterranean. These mariners raided Al-Andalus, the Arab-controlled lands of Spain and Portugal. They tested Arab strongholds and struck as far as North Africa. In the east, Scandinavians, later called Varangians, traveled along river routes toward the Black Sea, establishing trade posts among the dense forests inhabited by Slavic tribes such as the Krivichs, Ilmenslavs, and Chuds. In 862, these tribes invited the Norse leader Rurik to rule, and he established a base at Novgorod, laying the foundation of the Rus' polity. His successor Oleg moved the capital to Kiev in 882, positioning the Rus' between northern forests, steppes, and the wealth of Constantinople. In 907, the Rus prince Oleg, ruling from Kiev, launched a calculated military expedition against Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. Oleg's army was composed primarily of Varangians, augmented by Slavic levies from the Dnieper and surrounding principalities. Their longships enabled rapid navigation down the Dnieper and across the Black Sea, allowing the force to strike deep into Byzantine territory. Oleg divided his fleet and deployed detachments to threaten multiple points along the coastline simultaneously, using the element of surprise and the psychological impact of sudden amphibious assaults to pressure Constantinople into negotiation. The Byzantines, skilled in urban defense and siegecraft, relied on the city's formidable triple walls, chain-blocked harbors, and the garrison of imperial troops. However, Oleg avoided a full-scale siege that would have tested these defenses directly. Instead, he blockaded the harbor and demonstrated the destructive potential of his fleet, attacking nearby settlements, cutting off supply lines, and threatening the approaches to Constantinople. This combination of military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering compelled the Byzantines to negotiate. The resulting treaty granted the Rus' the right to conduct regular trade along the Dnieper and Black Sea routes, exchanging furs, honey, wax, and slaves for silver, wine, and luxury goods such as silks. Decades later, in 941, Oleg's successor, Igor, launched another campaign against Constantinople. Unlike Oleg, Igor's assault was a direct military confrontation. His fleet, larger than Oleg's, sailed to the Bosporus with the intent of imposing tribute or conquest. The Byzantines met the attack with the decisive application of Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that could cling to wood and metal, igniting ships and causing chaos among Igor's forces. The Rus' suffered catastrophic losses, with a significant portion of their fleet destroyed and many warriors killed or captured. Despite this setback, by 944 the two sides restored commercial relations, recognizing mutual benefit. The Rus were allowed to trade freely once more, and in time, many of their warriors entered Byzantine service. These Varangians, tall, heavily armed, and battle-hardened, became institutionalized as the Byzantine Varangian Guard, elite mercenaries sworn to protect the emperor. Meanwhile, Western Europe continued to contend with Viking pressure. By the mid-10th century, Viking expansion had transformed from raiding into settlement, trade, and governance. Rus' princes built cities along rivers, Normans cultivated former raid zones, and Varangians served foreign courts. Peak Viking warfare, society, and politics. The 9th century was dying out. Before dawn broke, Scandinavia lay wrapped in a hush. Along the Norwegian coast, fjords remained pools of ink beneath towering granite walls, their edges rimmed with frost that glimmered faintly in the half-light. A lone gust swept in from the Norwegian Sea, carrying salt and kelp, rippling across the water until it dissolved against the cliffs. In Denmark, winter clung stubbornly to the lowlands, marshes steaming under the first touch of morning warmth, wind rattling across open farmland where longhouses sat low against the horizon, their thatched roofs dark with dew. Sweden woke more slowly. Rivers uncoiled from the forests like silver threads, winding past burial mounds and wooden halls where jarls rose to greet another uncertain day. These landscapes carried whispers of change. Scandinavia was no longer a loosely connected constellation of chieftaincies. Local feuds that once involved a single fjord or valley now linked into broader struggles for supremacy. In the north, in the lowlands, in the deep forests, the old world trembled. To the west, the British Isles lay divided between Saxon kings, Norse settlers, and the fading shadows of older kingdoms. The North Sea, restless as a living thing, bound them to Scandinavia. To the south, the Carolingian realms fractured under dynastic pressures, leaving Francia rich yet vulnerable. The Baltic remained a theatre of shifting alliances and perilous waterways, while far to the east the steppes stretched outward beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon, carrying winds that shaped the fortunes of the Rus. By around AD 900, this rising pressure coalesced in a single figure whose ambition would reshape the north. Harald Fairhair was destined to unite the fragmented Norwegian chieftaincies under a single crown. In the fjords of western Norway, where the sea surged into narrow channels flanked by sheer cliffs, Harald's rivals had long battled for dominance. The mountains compressed the land into pockets of power, amplifying every feud. Yet in these rugged landscapes, Harald saw opportunity. Through campaigns, he challenged the old order of independent chieftains. In 872, Harald Fairhair faced the most decisive confrontation, the Battle of Hafrsfjord. The fjord itself, a narrow inlet near modern-day Stavanger, provided both a dramatic backdrop and a tactical crucible. Steep cliffs confined the waters, funneling ships into a channel where maneuverability was limited and any misstep could prove fatal. Harald, determined to impose his authority over rival petty kings and jarls along the western coast, assembled a fleet numbering several hundred longships. Each vessel carried between 40 and 60 warriors, including heavy-armed men with iron helmets, axes, swords, and spears, backed by lightly armored skirmishers trained in archery and shield wall combat. His opponents gathered a comparable force. The battle unfolded as a complex series of maneuvers within the constricted waters of the fjord. Harald's forces sought to dominate the channel by arranging their longships in tight formations, shields interlocked to create mobile defensive walls, while axes and spears were used to engage opponents at close range. He employed a combination of frontal assaults and flanking movements, using smaller, more agile ships to harry enemy flanks while the bulk of his fleet pressed the central line. Opposing chieftains relied on similar tactics, forming shield walls atop their vessels and attempting to board Harald's ships, seeking to break cohesion and scatter his formations. Oars splintered under blows, shields shattered, and warriors fell into icy waters, where only the strong swimmers or those rescued by comrades survived. The engagement lasted hours, and attrition eventually turned in Harald's favor. His superior coordination, the loyalty of his retainers, and the ability to rotate fresh units from reserves proved decisive against less disciplined opposition. Many of the defeated chieftains were killed, while others submitted to Harald's authority, agreeing to his rule in exchange for retaining local privileges. In the aftermath, Harald consolidated his hold over western Norway. He established a centralized monarchy that reduced the autonomy of local jarls and laid the foundation for a unified Norwegian kingdom. The victory at Hafrsfjord also sent a powerful message across the fjords and into surrounding regions. Resistance to Harald's unification was futile, and his fleet could enforce authority where diplomacy alone could not. Across the straits, Denmark followed its own path toward unification. In the 930s and 940s, Gorm the Old established the earliest firm anchor of the Danish monarchy, ruling over fertile lowlands threaded with marshes and farmland that lent itself to centralized control. By 958, Harald Bluetooth had ascended the throne of Denmark, inheriting a kingdom that was only partially unified and still steeped in the old pagan traditions. From the outset, Harald pursued a dual agenda of political consolidation and religious transformation. He enforced Christianity across his realm with both persuasion and coercion, compelling jarls and local leaders to accept baptism while punishing or exiling those who resisted. Pagan temples and sacred groves were dismantled and wooden idols were torn down. Clergy from the Holy Roman Empire were invited to establish churches, teach the new faith, and integrate Denmark into the continental religious and political networks, providing legitimacy to Harald's rule and a spiritual framework for governance. At the same time, Harald embarked on an unprecedented program of military and administrative engineering. He commissioned the construction of circular ring forts, known as Trelleborgs, which appeared across Jutland, Zealand, and Scania. These fortresses were extraordinary in their precision and design. They measured 120 to 150 meters in diameter with perfectly circular earthen ramparts reinforced with timber palisades. Inside, streets radiated from a central command area, dividing the interior into standardized plots that could house troops, supplies, and horses. Each fort contained barracks for infantry, storage for weapons and food, and watchtowers that commanded views of surrounding farmland and rivers. These trelleborgs served multiple purposes. Militarily, they acted as garrisons, protecting key trade routes and providing secure bases from which Harold could respond rapidly to local uprisings or foreign threats. Administratively, they symbolized centralized control, reinforcing the king's presence in regions that had previously been dominated by semi-independent chieftains. Strategically located near rivers, coasts, and roads, they allowed Harold to monitor movement, collect taxes, and enforce law and order. Their circular design allowed defenders to concentrate firepower along the walls and cover approaches from multiple angles. Denmark was no longer a loose network of territories, but a kingdom capable of defending itself, projecting influence abroad and integrating the pagan north into the Christian European world. While Norway and Denmark solidified under emerging dynasties, the Viking spirit continued to surge through Scandinavia. Longships glided through the Skagerrak, carrying traders to Hedeby, raiders to England, and emissaries to the Rus, where steppes and Byzantine courts shaped new worlds far from northern seas. Olaf Tryggvason returned to Norway in 995 after spending much of his early life abroad, including time in exile in the courts of Denmark, England, and possibly among the Rus in Novgorod, determined to consolidate the fragmented kingdom under Christianity. Born around 963, Olaf was of noble lineage connected to previous Norwegian rulers, but political instability and rival factions had forced him into youth exile. His campaign combined diplomacy, coercion, and military action. Chieftains were pressured to accept baptism or face exile, idols and sacred groves were destroyed, and churches were established in key settlements. His fleet, composed of several dozen longships, each carrying 40 to 60 heavily armed warriors, patrolled the fjords with remarkable speed, using the narrow waterways to project power and intimidate resistant jarls. His men were a mix of heavy-armed warriors with axes, swords, and spears, and lightly armored skirmishers skilled in archery and boarding actions. By the year 1000, Olaf's aggressive expansion and forced Christianization had earned him numerous enemies. Danish King Svein Forkbeard, Swedish King Olof Skotkonung, and Norwegian chieftains resentful of his authoritarian methods gathered a fleet larger than Olaf's own, with hundreds of ships arrayed along the Baltic coast near the island of Svolda. The Battle of Svolda unfolded amid treacherous waters, with ships weaving between rocky outcrops and narrow straits. Olaf attempted to maintain cohesion, forming a defensive line across his longships, axes, and spears, braced for close-quarter fighting. The coalition's strategy relied on enveloping his fleet, cutting off retreat routes, and bombarding the Norwegian vessels from multiple directions. Shields splintered, oars were destroyed, and many warriors plunged into the cold sea, either drowning or clinging to debris. Sails and rigging were torn, and the waves were churned with wreckage as Olaf's ships were systematically surrounded and battered. Olaf's final stand was both heroic and tragic. With his ships overwhelmed and his men slain or scattered, he leapt into the sea, refusing capture. Olaf's death left the kingdom fractured, with power reverting to regional chieftains and foreign influence increasing, particularly from Denmark and Sweden. Yet his campaign planted the idea of a unified Christian Norway. Although immediate political consolidation failed, the precedent of central authority and religious reform endured, influencing later kings. Into this unsettled realm came Olaf Haraldsson. Between 1015 and 1030, he consolidated the monarchy, codified laws, and extended Christian authority across resistant regions. On July 29, 1030, Olaf faced a broad coalition of local farmers, peasants, and regional chieftains who opposed his centralizing reforms and the spread of Christianity, as well as jarls who resented the loss of traditional autonomy. On the eve of the fateful Battle of Stiklestad, Olaf commanded roughly 6,000 men, including loyal retainers, knights, and levied forces from supportive regions, while the opposing coalition, drawn from Trondelag, Halogaland, and neighboring districts, numbered similarly, though many were lightly armed peasants augmented by professional warriors. The battlefield itself was a broad, rolling plain near the village of Stiklestad, whose open terrain limited the defensive advantage that natural features might have offered. Olaf arrayed his forces in a shield wall formation. He positioned heavy armed retainers in the center to absorb attacks, while lighter armed warriors and archers were placed on the flanks to harass the enemy and disrupt their formations. The battle began with a series of probing attacks, as the peasant levies, encouraged by local chieftains, tested the integrity of Olaf's lines. Fighting intensified into a brutal melee, with axes, swords, and spears clashing in close quarters. Contemporary accounts describe waves of attackers pressing against Olaf's shield wall, attempting to break it through sheer weight of numbers, while Olaf's men countered with thrusts, shield bashing, and coordinated strikes. Rain had turned the ground to mud, hampering cavalry and causing men to slip, while gusts of wind made missile weapons unpredictable. As the battle progressed, Olaf's forces began to falter. Attrition, exhaustion, and disorganization, especially among conscripted peasants, allowed the opposing coalition to exploit gaps in the formation. Olaf was struck multiple times, with some blows delivered by fellow Norwegians. When he finally fell, his body was left in the mud, though he was later recovered and buried. The aftermath of Stiklestad was politically complex. Militarily, it was a victory for the anti-centralization forces, temporarily halting Olaf's campaign. Yet in the longer term, the battle became a potent symbol of martyrdom. Stories of miracles at Olaf's gravesite circulated quickly, leading to his canonization as St. Olaf, which in turn strengthened the Christian monarchy and provided divine legitimacy for future kings. Meanwhile, Denmark's ambitions reached across the North Sea. In 1013, Svein Forkbeard crossed to England, asserting a claim to the throne. His son Knut continued the campaign after Svein's death, securing England by 1016 and ultimately uniting Denmark, Norway, and England into the North Sea Empire. However, after Knut's death in 1035, the empire fractured. By the mid-11th century, Scandinavia had transformed, Christian, consolidated, and politically sophisticated. Decline of the Viking Age. By the early 11th century, Scandinavia teetered between the old ways of raiding and a new era of kings, law, and faith. In Norway, fjords carved by glaciers funneled ambition into the hands of emerging monarchs, while rugged mountains and narrow valleys once dominated by competing jarls now bowed to the authority of central rulers. Denmark, under the descendants of Gorm the Old and Harald Bluetooth, saw lowlands and fertile plains transformed into centers of administration, dotted with stone churches and circular ring forts, the Trelleborgs. Even Sweden, with its vast forests and winding rivers, began the slow consolidation of fragmented clans into territories governed by stronger kings, their courts increasingly populated with priests, scribes, and officials to enforce law and Christian practice. Geography still dictated strategy. Rivers served as arteries for trade and troop movements, while fjords and marshes could hide or trap forces, but political structures now amplified the reach of authority beyond the old local strongholds. Longships, once raised solely for seasonal raids along the coasts of England, Francia, and the North Atlantic, now waited as instruments of defense, royal summons, and commercial exchange. Merchants carried iron, amber, furs, and walrus ivory through monitored ports and fortified harbors, while warriors found service tied to kings and their emerging kingdoms rather than individual plunder. Christianity spread steadily, displacing ancestral rites and legitimizing new monarchs. The old ethos of honor and retribution persisted, but increasingly intertwined with fealty, governance, and strategic alliances. The Viking world of raiding and independent warbands was giving way to kingdoms where kings, clergy, and merchants shared control over both land and sea, yet the elemental power of winter, fjords, and the restless North Sea continued to shape the lives and ambitions of those who called Scandinavia home. The quiet tension broke with Harald Hardrada. Once an exile and Varangian mercenary in Constantinople, he returned to Norway with wealth, experience, and ambition. His armies grew, drawn by loyalty and gold. In 1066, he launched a campaign across the North Sea toward England. At the Humber estuary, he landed with longships cutting through the waves, men ready for battle. At Stamford Bridge, Harald Hardrada's forces, numbering around 10,000 men, faced King Harold Godwinson's English force, composed of housecarls and levied fyrd. Hardrada's troops were composed primarily of veteran Norse warriors, battle-hardened infantry wielding axes, swords, and round shields, with some lighter troops skilled in archery. Godwinson's men, meanwhile, relied on disciplined shield walls, well-trained in coordinated maneuvers and defensive cohesion, reinforced by mounted and foot levies from the surrounding regions. The battle unfolded along the riverbanks near the village of Stamford Bridge, where the Norse had been caught off guard after a long march inland. The English took advantage of the terrain, forcing Hardrada's forces to fight across a constricted battlefield. Initial skirmishes erupted as scouts and advance parties clashed, but soon the main armies engaged. Hardrada's shield walls pressed forward in the traditional Norse wedge formations, axes flashing and spears bristling, attempting to break the English line. Godwinson's housecarls responded with tightly interlocked shields and thrusting spears, absorbing charges and counterattacking with disciplined volleys. The fighting surged back and forth. River fords and muddy banks complicated maneuvers. Archers sought to disrupt formations. The turning point came as Hardrada, overextended and isolated on the field, saw his lines disrupted by flanking attacks and local English levies pressing from the rear. Exhausted from the sudden forced march and facing a cohesive enemy, the Norse formations began to fragment. Hardrada himself fought at the front and was killed by a thrust to the throat or head, sending a shockwave through his troops. Once their king fell, morale collapsed, many Norse warriors surrendered, were slain or fled to the remaining ships. The aftermath decisively ended the Norwegian threat to England and marked one of the final large-scale examples of traditional Viking raiding armies clashing with organized, centralized infantry under a monarch's command. After Stamford Bridge, raiding and conquest waned. Scandinavian kingdoms consolidated under Christian rule, fortified towns defended coasts, and trade became the central engine of wealth. The fjords, rivers, and seas remained, but they now nurtured states rather than fueling distant conquest. The Viking Age faded, leaving only its memory behind. William the Conqueror. Scandinavia awoke once again beneath misted fjords, windswept lowlands, and slow, surging rivers. Beyond its coasts, the North Atlantic bound a world of hardened kingdoms, patrolled rivers, and restless steppes, where power, trade, and warfare intertwined. In this shifting order, the heirs of the Viking Age, Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish realms, stood transformed. Warriors no longer roamed for plunder alone, but served kings and laws, their ships and skill now instruments of state and commerce. Yet the memory of the old ways lingered, etched in longhouses, in crafted hulls, and in songs of daring and conquest. Nowhere was this legacy more visible than across the Channel in Normandy, where descendants of Viking settlers had carved out a principality both fiercely martial and profoundly adaptive. For more than a century, the Normans, born of Norse blood yet steeped in Frankish language, feudal custom, and Christian law, had grown into a force with ambition far beyond their narrow strip of coastline. Their cavalry thundered across open fields with the precision of a single mind. Their dukes commanded a loyalty forged through calculated generosity and iron discipline. Their monasteries and courts pulsed with wealth pulled from conquered lands and bustling harbours. In the castle at Rouen, the scent of tanned leather and oiled mail mingled with the cool draught from the Seine, and among its halls, William, Duke of Normandy, carried within him the restless energy of his Viking forebears. Across the sea, England stood as both a prize and a challenge. King Edward the Confessor's death in January 1066 had left the kingdom's succession uncertain, its magnates divided, its frontiers alert but uneasy. Harold Godwinson, newly crowned, sought stability through speed. In late September, after Hardrada's assault at Stamford Bridge faltered and broke beneath Harold Godwinson's rushed counterattack, the English king paused only long enough to bury the dead before turning south. His army was exhausted, battered, its ranks thinned by the ferocity of the northern battle. Yet the winds along the Channel carried ominous news. William had landed at Pevensey. The Norman duke stood upon English soil, his cavalry disembarking, his archers assembling, his banners unfurling in the autumn sun. The conquest had begun. On the slopes near Hastings, beneath a sky streaked with drifting clouds, the English shield wall formed, a living rampart of men armed with axes, spears, and grim resolve. It was October 14th, 1066. William's army comprised a highly disciplined and balanced force of roughly 7,000 men, divided into three core components: infantry armed with spears, swords, and shields, a cavalry of heavily armoured knights trained for charges and flanking manoeuvres, and archers who launched volleys of arrows to disrupt enemy formations. Harold's force, approximately 5,000 to 7,000 strong, relied primarily on infantry, housecarls, professional retainers wielding axes and swords, and the fyrd, local levies drawn from English shires, equipped more lightly with spears, bows and shields. The battle unfolded as a tense interplay of Norman attacks and Saxon resilience. Initial Norman assaults relied heavily on archers, who attempted to pierce the shield wall, followed by infantry advances to probe gaps. Cavalry charges were then executed to break and envelop sections of the wall, exploiting any disruption caused by archery or feigned retreats. William used deception, ordering controlled withdrawals to draw parts of Harold's forces downhill into vulnerable positions, breaking the cohesion of the shield wall. Fighting was close and brutal, with repeated waves of Norman troops clashing against steadfast Saxons. Harold's forces managed to repel early assaults, but the Norman coordination, combined with sustained archery and strategic cavalry maneuvers, gradually eroded their defense. This was followed by the deaths of prominent Saxon leaders and, finally, Harold himself, who was struck in the eye by an arrow. The English lines buckled and routed. With William's coronation at Christmas 1066, the legacy of the Viking Age took on a new and unforeseen form. Norse descendants now sat upon the English throne, shaping its laws, language, architecture, and aristocracy. The echoes of longships faded, replaced by stone keeps, feudal levies, and the slow, deliberate reorganization of a conquered realm. Yet beneath this new order, the deeper threads of northern heritage continued to hum. The Norman cavalry charge carried traces of Viking daring. The administrative structures imposed upon English shires reflected an inherited taste for authority honed through generations of Scandinavian consolidation. The great wooden halls of England gave way to Norman stone, but the cultural fusion that followed carried forward memories of both. In Iceland, far from the centres of European politics, the sagas began to take written form during the 12th and 13th centuries. These long, winding narratives, part family chronicle, part heroic biography, preserved the oral traditions of a world already fading into history. Archaeological discoveries deepened the picture further. Ships unearthed at Gokstad and Oseberg revealed the astonishing craftsmanship that propelled Norse expansion. Hulls built with elegance and balance, carved details alive with curling beasts and interwoven lines, burial goods that reflected both daily life and spiritual complexity. Thus, the Norman conquest was a final echo of northern restlessness reverberating through a rapidly changing world, a world that absorbed the Viking legacy into its very foundations.